Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for episode 10 of season 4 of Black Writers Read. My name is Nicole Young Martin, and I am the founder and producer and host of. Thank you, StreamYard. You keep doing this. This happened last week. Um, First, I'd like to begin our time together by honoring the life of poet, music critic, radio DJ, educator, and jazz scholar Reuben Jackson, who passed away yesterday. Born in Georgia and raised in DC, Reuben crafted a beautiful career for himself in Vermont and Washington, DC. He's worked for Vermont Public Radio, served as the curator of the Smithsonian's Duke Ellington collection from 1989 to 2009, and most recently served as archivist with the University of the District of Columbia's Felix E. Grant Jazz Archives. Reuben is a contributor to Kwame Alexander's recently released This is the Honey, an anthology of contemporary Black poets. Many people in the Black Writers Read community have worked with Reuben and are grieving this very deep loss. I am sending lots of love, patience, and support your way and holding you close to my heart as you honor his life in this moment. Thanks to everyone who is joining us today for holding space in this moment. Let's get today's conversation started. Black Writers Read showcases, celebrates, and honors the words, work, and traditions of Black writers from across the country, across genres, across experiences, and across the African diaspora. Black Writers Read is a behind-the-scenes conversation into the craft and what it means to create as a Black author in today's society. Since starting the series during the summer of 2020, we've hosted over 60 authors representing 10 plus genres from 4 countries and 15 states. Today, we welcome Donna Hemans. Donna Hemans is the author of 3 novels, River Woman, Tea by the Sea, and The House of Plain Truth. Her short fiction and essays have appeared in Slice, Electric Literature, Ms. Magazine, The Rumpus, Crab Orchard Review, among others. She received her undergraduate degree in English and Media Studies from Fordham University and an MFA from American University. She lives in Maryland and is also the owner of DC Writers Room, a co-working studio for writers based in Washington, D.C. Central to today's conversation is Donna's recently released novel, The House of Plain Truth, published by Zibby Books. The House of Plain Truth is a lyrical, lush, evocative story about a fractured Jamaican family and a daughter determined to reclaim her home. When Pearline receives grave news about her ailing father, she abruptly leaves Brooklyn for her childhood home in Jamaica. But Pearline isn't prepared for a tense reunion with her sisters or for her father's startling deathbed wish that she repair their long broken family legacy and find the sister and 2 brothers no one has seen in more than 50 years. Moving through time and place. From modern day Brooklyn and Montego Bay to 1930s Savannah and back again, The House of Plain Truth is a journey through generational secrets and a family coming to terms with its past. Inspired by the author's own history, the soulful novel explores a fascinating story of immigration, divided loyalties, and what one woman must sacrifice in an attempt to find home. To learn more about Donna and her expansive body of work, please visit donnahemans.com. That is DonnaHemans.com. Hemans.com. Throughout our conversation today, I'll be sharing the link to her website and also information on her Instagram page. When preparing for our conversation, I ask our guests, why do they write? Here's Donna's response to the prompt. There's an African proverb that says, until the lion tells the story, the hunter will always be the hero. For too long, our stories have been told by others, and I write to do my part in telling our own stories and telling and owning our stories. For those who are new to Black Writers Read, here's the format of the show. Donna will come on and read an excerpt from her book, and then we'll chat about her book and her career. If time remains at the end of the conversation, we'll open it up to question and answer. For those of us who are joining today, we typically have viewers joining us from both Facebook and YouTube. Today, I'm trying something new. I am now streaming live to Instagram. So, welcome to everyone joining from Instagram. So, if you have a question, please feel free to include it in the comments section on the platform where you're joining us from today. I will compile the questions and either pose them to our guests following our conversation or insert them during an appropriate time within our chat. I'd now like to bring Donna onto the virtual stage.
Hi, Nicole. Thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and the stage is yours.
Okay, so I think I'll start with a very short reading from the first chapter of the book. So, as you know, Pearline has gone back to Jamaica. And one of the things that she and her sisters do on a daily basis is ask their father to name their children. And part of that is just to test his memory because he is in his 90s and has dementia. So the section I'm going to read is occurs right after he has named all of his children. Rupert named his children, and now Pearline begins to think that some people refuse to be forgotten. These siblings of hers who have lived only in her family's collective memory, of a moment on a wharf in Santiago de Cuba, want to be heard. That moment, which marks the last time the living members of her family were together, is stamped in her memory. She replays it now as she has done over the years. Rupert wears his best suit and hat. He's never without his hat. And her mother, Irene, wears a starched white dress, her belly big with the baby she would name Ermina. Pearline is 4 and Eileen 7. Those are the two girls who returned in 1933 to Jamaica. Their oldest sister, Annie, is already a married woman who chooses to stay behind in Cuba. And David and Gerardo, soon to be men, are staying behind too. Irene extracts a promise from Annie to take care of the boys. The goodbyes are loud and long, and the voices like a cacophony of birds, English and Haitian Creole spoken by the people who are leaving, and Spanish from those overseeing the departures. Annie leans over, whispers, "On a clear day you can see Cuba from there." Pearline believes her, and she and Eileen look out at the blue sea for a glimpse of the distant island, Jamaica. And then they're gone. The last two baby girls in the family, repatriated at the government's expense to an island they had never known. Ermina was nearly born on the ship, but Irene makes it ashore before the baby comes. There isn't room on the ship even for a song. A single whistle maybe, but not a song. Rupert wants no disturbance, no outward signs of displeasure or anxiety or disappointment. A ship's passage paid for by the government isn't the way he wants to return home. He wants to come home like the men who went to Panama, the Colon man with his gold chain and pocket watch. So he finds fault in everything: the waves that rock the boat, the men who report from deck on the land visible in the distance, the clouds that roll behind, threatening rain, Pearline and Eileen nervous and fidgeting, looking forward. From where they stand, there is no looking back. Even if they could have looked back, Rupert would have ordered them not to. From the moment he stepped onto the ship, he turned his back on Cuba and his children left behind on the wharf, until now, this moment when he calls the forbidden names. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. And this is such a great way to start the conversation. So, the first question I have is, what is the origin story of the House of Plain Truth? I'd also love to know the story behind the title and why this book right now.
So the story behind it basically is that my grandparents migrated to Cuba in 1917 and lived there for about 11 years. They returned to Jamaica in 1931. And that was a period of time when a lot of people from the English speaking and French speaking Caribbean, particularly Haiti, moved to Cuba to work in the sugarcane industry. And they were just a part of that wave. But one of the things, so I had known just the basic fact that they were there, that, which uncles and aunts were born in Cuba and who was born in Jamaica, but none of the nitty gritty details about my grandparents' life in Cuba. And so I wanted to understand what that experience was like what drove them to move and why they decided to come back to Jamaica when they did. And so that really is where the story itself came from. I didn't have, by the time I got around or got to that point in my life where I was ready to ask those questions, my grandparents were already dead. So I couldn't ask them. And there was only so much my family members, my father, my uncles, aunts, I knew. So I had to do a lot of research to try to figure out what the story was about. So the why now? I don't know that there is a now. That I started writing this book in 2000, about 2006. And so it just took a while for me to get the story right and to write something that I was happy with, or to tell the story that I wanted to tell. So that's that's it.
Congratulations on finally getting it published. I didn't realize you started writing it in 2006.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it was a long journey. I had multiple drafts of this story, and I think a part of the issue was that when I started telling the story, I was trying to tell Perlene's story through her teenage, I mean, like 18-year-old grandniece. And I think there was only some things that this 18-year-old, she had no experience in the world. She couldn't tell that story properly. And so it wasn't until about 2016 that I realized that Perlene had to tell her own story. And so once I made that shift, I think the book really just fell into place and became what it is today.
Nice. So this is a great segue into the next question. Readers of the House of Plain True follow the story through the perspective of a third person narrative. Why did you make this particular choice and how does it serve the story and its characters?
Yeah, so that third person narrative, initially it was in the first person through this 18-year-old. And, like as I was saying, one of the struggles with telling that story is that the 18-year-old was, I mean, she was telling or trying to figure out for herself what that experience, the family's experience in Cuba. But she didn't have, there was just nothing else in her life beyond that. And I think that that limited her as a character. But once I switched to the third person narrative, and I think it certainly could also have been first person, but third person
Mhm.
just felt right for this story. And I think once I found that voice, that right voice, the way to tell the story, it fell into place. And I think too, with the third person narrative, there were lots of the story that Perlene herself didn't know because she was 3, 4 years old when the family returned to Jamaica from Cuba. So she didn't have the experience in Cuba to be able to tell that story, I think, fully from a first person perspective. But I think shifting to the third person, even though it's told through her, gave me a lot more space to be able to tell some of the things that happened that she didn't directly experience.
Yeah, that was one of the things I really appreciated about the story, especially the opening, not to give it away, but like the one of the opening moments um at the burial of Perlene's father, like just well, one, I was able to kind of project my own experience on it because my father recently passed away. And so to do it from the third person narrative, it gives it a very different and much richer experience. And then also, too, I think it, in looking at that type of ritual in life, and this leads into the next question, it adds something to the conversation about the diasporic experience. So that I really appreciated that choice of the narrative.
Mhm.
The House of Plain Truth opens with the death of Pearline's father, Rupert, and his funeral. How does opening a protagonist's journey with such a pivotal yet sad and anticipated milestone contribute to Pearline's subjectivity and how she'll be present within her own story?
Um, I think I tend to begin my books by, just simply jumping in. You drop right in. There isn't, like pages and pages and pages where you build towards the big moment. It just simply happens. I think a part of that is just from my journalism experience, where you, you begin the story. In the first paragraph, you're supposed to tell the who, what, where, when, and why. And I think in some ways I tend to do that when I'm writing fiction as well, where the major thing is happening. It's beginning the story. So that's a part of it. And I think the second part, though, is that once you get that out of the way, it frees up, in at least for me, to tell a different kind of story. It's not a story that's building up to to Rupert dying, but it's more a story about what happens in the aftermath of death. Because I think sometimes that so much of living happens afterwards when we're dealing with like a big issue. That's when we grow. That's when we figure out exactly who we are. And I think that that is what is happening here for Pearline and for her sisters, because she has to figure out not just how to fulfill her father's wish, but who she is as this person who has returned to Jamaica, who she is within this family, who she is as a sister to within this group, within this family where both her sisters have been together for like 30 years, have been like side by side doing things together, and she hasn't. So I think there is a lot in that process of growth for Pearline as an individual and for Pearline as a part of the family that I think would be blunted or would be a different kind of growth had the story been shifted where we're seeing her taking care of her father as opposed to figuring out what to do after he has died.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense now. Um, this book, like one of the things it did, and this goes into the next question. I took a couple of courses in Caribbean literature when I was doing my master's in English, and it's just something about the way that the diasporic experience is rendered, I think, in that section of the canon in terms of writers writing from like the Caribbean lived experience. This book represents so beautifully so much of the diasporic experience from the places that are rendered in the story, along with the specific time periods within the story. The House of Plain Truth is uniquely Caribbean, African diasporic, and also about Blackness within the United States at the same time. How are you able to render such richness in the story? And you mentioned a little bit at the beginning about this, but if you can expand upon some of the source material for the House of Plain Truth.
So, okay, so I'll start with a source material. I ended up doing a lot of research, reading through old newspapers, spent a lot of, yeah, a couple of days at the Library of Congress, like looking through, like old Jamaican newspapers and some Cuban newspapers to really try and understand what was happening during that time, and also some academic material. And so I think a lot of the information that I wouldn't necessarily have got, even like our family stories are also like just personal stories, like, well, this happened to me, without some of the context. And so I think I was able to get a lot of the context and then figure out like personally how a Jamaican family um, would have moved within like within that like context itself. So that was the research itself. But coming now to the diasporic experience, is that like I think all of us, regardless of where we are, whether we're in America, in the Caribbean, or in England, I think movement has been a big part of our story. And that like both movement and also trying to find a home or figure out where exactly is home, that is a big part of our story, and that is a big part of the story here. For the Jamaican experience in particular, we have been moving for years. So, like in early 1900s or late 1800s, there was the movement to Panama to help build the Panama Canal. There was movement to Cuba. There was movement to Costa Rica, like throughout the Caribbean. And then, of course, movement to England and to America. So that is, like a part of our story. And I think it's the same here when you look at, like the United States. People have been moving from the south to the north, from east to west, just simply trying to find a place where they can live and survive. And I think that is the diasporic story that is here in the House of Plain Truth.
Yeah, and thank you for that history lesson because I was always wondering because I have some friends who are of Panamanian ancestry via Jamaica, and I didn't realize the why. So thank you for the why. That helped out so much.
Yeah, I think that is one of the things that so many people don't, really know because it's not taught. That, I was on another conversation earlier where, like another person was saying pretty much the same thing, that there are so many people he knew from the Dominican Republic who had like English sounding names. And it was, it took him some time for him to realize that these were people who had moved from English speaking Caribbean islands to cut cane, and that's the reason they have these English names. But a lot of that movement just, like we haven't really been, a lot of books aren't talking about that kind of movement. The majority of books about the Caribbean migration experience or immigrants, the immigrant experience really focuses on the immigrant in America or in England or in Canada, but not really looking at what happens or that movement around the Caribbean itself.
Mhm. And I think this kind of answers my next question. So I'll kind of change it up a little bit. So, and I think this is just because of just the circles that I'm in, because I'm a poet and playwright, and I'm also writing a memoir right now. So it's rare that Black Writers Read has an opportunity to chat with a fiction author. And I was just like, oh my God, this is you have no idea how excited I was to talk with you. So this is a two-part question. So from your perspective, what are some advantages and limitations about the genre? Why do you think it's important for writers of the diaspora to explore the genre? And then lastly, because so much of this book, I was like, why fiction and not memoir for the story, given that you are citing some material from your family?
Well, I'll start with the second part. I don't know that I have enough from my family to be able to tell that story. Um, I would require, I guess, a lot of research, and maybe at some point, I might be able to dig up enough to figure out, like what that story is and how to tell that story.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I don't. I mean, other than writing short essays, I don't have any big ideas about writing a memoir. Fiction is my world. I like making stuff up, and I think it's just so much easier for me to write fiction than it is to write nonfiction. I think a part of writing for me is to discover something. So I usually am starting with a question. There is, like in this book in particular, I wanted to understand what my grandparents' experience was like. So that was the discovery for me. I feel though with, like writing about my life, I'm living it. I think I might not know everything about of what I'm living and what it means, but I know so much more of it that I don't know that I'd have the same kind of joy writing about my life as I do writing fiction, because there is something that I'm learning, something that I'm trying to put in context in, like whether in this case in particular, putting something from, like 1920s 1930s in context with like a more modern woman's life. So it's fiction just gives me a lot more room to play.
Nice. And it's a skill that I hope to get because I just love like the exercise of the imagination and the exercise of like expanding our realities within
Right.
fiction.
Mhm.
Yeah. The House of Plain Truth, memory could operate as its own character. What role does memory play in the narrative and how does it contribute to Perling's characterization?
So memory is particularly important, and the first part of it is that her father when he's dying, he asks her to be his memory, which is not something that she fully understands. She doesn't know necessarily what stories he wants her to remember and the why. And so I think it's in going through or in trying to understand or remember bits and pieces of the past, either what she had heard her parents talking about or what she experienced, in order to understand what that what her father meant and how it applies to finding her siblings. But I think, like even just in general, memory is just so important. um, and I think one of the things that, like I keep thinking about and looking to is that so many people in my parents' generation, I think, grew up with the idea that there's some things that you don't talk about. And I mean, not just their generation, but a generation before that. And so there are lots of stories that, these are things that happened and, oh, well, it's in the past, let's just set it aside. So I think sometimes it probably means that the memory is kind of fractured, and or the stories, we don't have all the stories. So in some ways, I feel like this book is looking at and playing with this idea of, collective memory. And, in this case, in Pearline's case, it's the family's memory, that it's hers, but it's also the family's memory. It's her sisters. It's everybody's. So I think for me, it's really looking at, like what previous generations have really set aside or have been taught to set aside in order to just continue to look to the future or to look to some other place, as opposed to our own history and our own past and our own memories.
The House of Plain Truth, this things just segue so nicely in this conversation. I'm loving it. The House of Plain Truth is a family story that spans multiple generations. I'd love to hear from you a recommendation for emerging Caribbean authors on how to construct narratives of family dramas when readers will be so diverse. Why is it so vital? This is my academic self multi-layered question. Why is it so vital to these stories to include similar themes to that of the House of Plain Truth, like generational healing, colonialism, loss, grief, migration, family secrets, and such rich details around life's moments and required rituals like funerals? What tasks should be assigned to a book's narrator? What responsibilities should protagonists assume? And how much should personal experiences, as opposed to previously published and already acquired history, contribute to the overall story? It's a large question.
Yes, that is a large question. I think that, one of the things that I love about books that are coming out of the Caribbean right now is that they are so diverse. That I think for a long while, a lot of the stories that I felt that immigrant writers were, quote unquote, allowed to write was the story of migration and the story really of the immigrant in the new country. And I feel that now the stories that you're seeing are broader. There are stories that are pulling from, like different types of folklore, but are not necessarily the older stories about folklore that we'd probably be accustomed to. It's much more than that. It's stories about immigration, yes, but it's not the, like here I am in the new country and everything is so new and shiny. It's not that story. It's a different kind of story about migration. It's in some ways a story about a family that is not necessarily doing well in this new country. It's, like broader stories about what is happening in the Caribbean. There was a book a couple of years ago from a woman in Barbados, Sherry Jones, I think I got her name right, about, the experience with tourism in Barbados. There is a lovely book that came out, I believe, last year from a Trinidadian writer, Kevin Jared Hussein, called Hungry Ghosts, which is about the experience of Hindus in Trinidad. So there is just so much, a wide range of stories picking on or pulling in, like, our wide and varied and diverse stories. And that, I think, is what the focus should be on. What is your story, as opposed to trying to think about what is that one Caribbean story that you can tell? Because I don't think there is any one story. There is no one issue that your story should also cover. One of the focuses that one of the things that I try to focus on or write about is the people who are left behind. And in this case, Pearline goes back to Jamaica. So, like, there are those stories as well. What is happening within the, various islands, as opposed to just what is happening outside of the country. So my advice would be really tell your story. I can find different stories, look for the stories that have not yet been told and tell those stories, because there are a lot of them. And I think people are hungry for a lot more and diverse stories.
Nice. You've written in various forms, including short stories, novels, and essays. And as I learned earlier when you mentioned it, you did journalism, which I totally didn't realize. How much would you say has your literary voice evolved since your first published piece? And how does your voice differ among the various forms of writing?
I think that they're similar. I hope
Mhm.
that they're similar. I think I tend to try to write with that lyrical voice across everything that I do. So I think I think you will find that in my essays as well as my fiction. Um, but I think my writing has changed. My first book was told in the first person, my
Mm.
second in the third, and the third in the third person. So I think I don't know. I have not done second person yet, so maybe that's next, or we're somewhere down the line. But I think that as writers, sometimes we find a place that we're comfortable in, and that remains um, and that voice remains present across our work. So I'm not sure how to define or how to describe how my style has changed or how my voice has changed. I think I would love to hear, like, from people who have read all of my books, if they, what they have to say about what that change is. But for me, I think across my works, I think I don't want to say I sound the same, but I think you can pick up something and know that I wrote it, or I hope so anyway. That's my hope.
Nice. How would you like for your voice and work to contribute to the literary canon?
I think my whole goal, I believe, is to tell Caribbean stories. And sometimes I think even saying to tell Caribbean stories is just too broad, because each country is so different. I mean, there are lots of similarities, yes, but there are also so many differences that I probably really should just be saying I want to tell Jamaican stories. But then that also feels too limiting, because there is this diasporic story that all of us, or so many of us, can relate to. So I mean, I think one of the things that I think I started out, like, very early on in my career, is that I wanted to incorporate a lot of, like, folklore or cultural stuff in my fiction. I think I did that a little bit in my first novel. And the second, I'm not sure I did much of that. The third, I definitely pulled in, like, Cuba story, the Cuban history. And hopefully in my fourth, I will, the one I'm working on now, which I hope will be the fourth, should pull in a lot more of that. So I don't want to limit myself, in any way at all, but, like, to really just tell stories that feel like, to the Jamaican people, like their stories being told. And, like, really Caribbean people, anybody across from the diaspora, to really know and to feel that this is ours, that this is theirs, that, it's their story.
Nice. And then lastly, what is next for you and how can the Black Writers Read community support you on this journey?
Okay, so next, I am working on another book. Hopefully, I'll finish it sometime this year. It's another book I've been working on for a while. So I, again, finally know how to tell the story I want to tell. And support for writers is just simply broad. Like, this conversation, having writers on is vitally important, because we don't always get to talk about our work. So it's really nice to have these kinds of conversations. And support is, like, buying books and talking about them, whether it's, like, writing a short review or posting something on Instagram, or um, you know, like a um, like a review on Amazon or in any place where you've bought a book or where you're allowed to do that. Because I think those things matter. Because so many of our books, there's so many books. First of all, that like any reader can pick from. But I think sometimes that books can also get lost because one, you have to get through so many. But like there's always the new shiny object, the new shiny book that comes out. And so I think the more that we are able to talk about what we're reading, whether it's something new or something older, I think it just simply helps every writer, not just me, but like every writer get their story told.
Yeah, and thank you also for mentioning the importance of the conversations with writers, because I'm probably one of maybe 5 podcasts that talk to Black
Mm,
authors, and I including, Black Writer Studio out of, the Hurston Wright Foundation and, Black and Published by, Nikisha Elise Williams. Those are at least 2 that I could think of right now, and, like, I love that many of the authors, like, that have we I've noticed that our authors kind of bounce around a little bit, but I love that because, like, we all have access to so many different audiences, and I have to keep reminding myself that the authors that are featured within our conversations, their work is still really marginalized and can get lost with the new shiny things. Like I'm like, if I see one more new consumer product show up on TikTok that Gen Alphas need to purchase, I'm like, yes.
yeah.
So yes, I really appreciate that. And also too, that just really affirms for me the importance of keeping this space going in the way that I
Right. Yes. Thank you. We all appreciate it.
have. Yeah, so this wraps up our conversation. Donna, thank you so much for being on this afternoon. It was so great to finally get an opportunity to chat with you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Nicole. It was a pleasure. I really appreciate you having me on, and it was lovely talking with you. Thanks.
Same here. Have a great afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and
Thanks.
do some wrap up. So, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for episode 10 of season 4 of Black Writers Read. Be sure to check out our website at blackwritersread.com for past episodes and information on upcoming guests and events. Subscribe to my YouTube channel to keep up with episodes of both Black Writers Read and my other projects. Also, be sure to subscribe to the audio podcast, which is available on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Google Podcasts as we post audio from each episode about a week or so after the live stream. Before I officially wrap up today, I want to give a very special shout out to one of my besties, Dr. Rachel Jessica Daniel, for bringing Donna Hemans to my attention. So this is so awesome. Thanks to all of our viewers for spending your afternoon with us, and more importantly, for ensuring that Black authors continue to matter. Have a great afternoon.